It's not like it was affecting them. It's like he was doing something bad to them, so they got out and killed him. Oof. No, they ripped his dick off because they didn't like the fact he gave the other chimp a birthday cake.
What is up? Kerry Cronic here, and as you can tell by the title, today we're going to talk about the 5 most common things you'll most likely hear on the Joe Rogan Podcast. So Joe Rogan is fairly diverse in the things he'll talk about and the people he'll bring in. The topics range anywhere from like dumbass stupidity and like the ignorance in the world on to him having like a scientist like Neil deGrasse Tyson in and talking about physics and really complicated scientific stuff. So he's definitely a really diverse person in general, and like all the things that he's interested in and all the things that he is willing to talk about. But there are definitely some things that he has a routine of mentioning within his podcast, and I have narrowed it down to 5 different things, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. I think it's safe to say that Joe Rogan is pretty much the king of podcasts. I have personally been following him since like maybe 100 to 200 episodes in. Before, I didn't even know Joe Rogan other than him being like that Fear Factor guy. But his podcast has definitely blown up into being probably the #1 podcast out there. I can't say for sure, I don't know the numbers, but in my opinion, he is the king of podcasts. I think that's pretty safe to say, but who knows, I might get some backlash for saying that. And with his podcast being as big as it is, it's definitely made him a very large voice of this generation, and there's a lot of importance that falls onto his shoulders when he's running these podcasts, which obviously has a big effect on society in general and the way people are getting information. And a lot of people go to people like Joe Rogan for their info and updates on the world. So he's definitely a very influential person over today's society. But to get on with the point of the video, 5 things that he commonly mentions.
Wow.
Yeah, yep.
How much do you smoke a day?
First thing on the list is going to be conspiracy theories. The conspiracies range from basically any topic, anywhere from the moon landing to the 9/11 conspiracy to flat earth. He claims to not really be that big into conspiracy theories, but it is definitely something common that is mentioned within the show. And especially when guests like Eddie Bravo come on, like it's pretty much a guaranteed conspiracy theory fest when he comes.
Witnesses. This is from that same documentary?
Ninth Circle.
See, but how do they know that for a fact?
You just got to watch it and make the
conclusion.
Mainly because Eddie Bravo himself is really big into conspiracy theories, and that's just kind of what he brings to the table. And it's super widely known that if Eddie Bravo is on the podcast, it's going to be full of conspiracy theories. But Joe Rogan definitely expands on with conspiracy theories and talks about a lot of this stuff pretty frequently with other guests. And it is definitely a topic that you can expect to hear on the Joe Rogan Podcast.
I go back and forth with conspiracies. I have a love-hate relationship with conspiracies.
So moving on to the next on the list, another topic that he brings up probably in just about every podcast is going to be weed and or psychedelic drugs.
I get stoned all day when I don't have shit to do.
Got you.
But if I have too much shit to do and I get stoned all day, that shit doesn't get done.
You said you like blunts?
Yeah.
Why you like blunts?
So Joe Rogan definitely doesn't hide his interest in drugs or the drugs that he does specifically. And he's definitely a big advocate in things like weed and certain types of psychedelic drugs. He was even featured in a documentary called DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which is a documentary about the drug DMT, which is probably hands down the most powerful drug out there, or at least the most powerful psychedelic out there. I can't speak from experience, but he commonly mentions going to basically a whole new dimension where reality and language is something completely not what it is here. And he claims these types of drugs have had a big influence on the way he thinks and the way he looks at the world. And not only does he talk about these kinds of drugs and things like that, but he often frequently smokes weed on his podcast with guests. Sometimes he'll not smoke on his podcast if his guest is like someone who is doing sobriety or like had a problem with drugs within the past. People like Steve-O. When Steve-O was on the podcast, he didn't smoke at all, but they definitely talked about drugs and drug experiences within that podcast. And one of his biggest moments with smoking weed on the podcast is the now legendary moment that he smoked weed with Elon Musk on the podcast.
There's tobacco and marijuana in there. That's all it is.
And that moment alone caused an insane amount of controversy, even though they were smoking legally in a legal state. But because it was Elon Musk and it was very open and public on the internet, it stirred up some controversy, mainly due to how big of a figure Elon Musk is and the way people look at Elon Musk. But in general, if someone is known to be an open weed smoker, he's probably going to be smoking weed with that guest on the podcast. He's had people like Wiz Khalifa on, Joey Diaz and him always smoke on the podcast, and definitely many, many more. It's definitely a very common occurrence for him to be smoking and talking about weed on the podcast.
It's a great tragedy, in my opinion, that our culture has demonized these substances and put them in this category of forbidden fruit to the point where you're so nervous about doing them.
And moving on to the next one. This one I kind of combined a bunch of different things into one because they all kind of tie into why it's even brought up on the subject. And that is the UFC, martial arts, and diet. Joe Rogan talks about his past in martial arts experiences a lot and how that has shaped him to be very disciplined. And that obviously being tied into his thoughts on health and diet and things like that. All of this comes up super often on the podcast and definitely has a way of making me feel like garbage because I am not near that disciplined and I'm not near that healthy with my diet. But it's definitely a good thing. With how big his voice is on the internet, it's definitely something that a lot of people should probably hear because there's definitely a big obesity problem in America. And also his history with martial arts and diet and things like that brought him into being a commentator for the UFC. And he fell into that role really, really early in the UFC history. He was one of the first commentators of UFC. He used to go to a lot of matches and even took a break from commentating UFC and then came back to it. And his history with things like martial arts definitely easily led him to the place of being a commentator for UFC. Not only has he frequently talked and commentated for the UFC, but he has a segment within the podcast called The Fight Companion, where him and a bunch of his friends get together and they watch fights and basically commentate at the standpoint from the podcast. So if you watch the podcast, that is definitely something you're most likely going to hear at some point or another.
I mean, it ain't good.
No.
It's not good to eat just constant bullshit.
And moving on to the next on the list, we have stand-up comedy. And not only is he a commentator or a podcaster, but he is also a stand-up comedian who tours pretty frequently. And his work within the stand-up comedy realm is definitely a part of what has gotten him to the place that he is today.
It's like, why can't I talk about something?
Yeah.
Like, it's not mean. I'm not a bad person to talk about a real thing that you see and I see.
Yeah.
Like, what is that?
He first started doing stand-up comedy in the late 80s and early 90s, and that is definitely a big part of what got him commentating for things like Fear Factor or news radio. And those things obviously built up and got to where he is now. And if you are a frequent watcher of the podcast, you will know the most inner circle of his podcast are going to be other stand-up comedians. And a lot of his stand-up comedians friends have their own podcast, so he goes on their podcast and they come on his podcast. So it's like an inner circle of helping each other grow their podcast. But other common guests that he has on that are his inner circle of stand-up comedian friends are people like Joey Diaz, Tom Segura, Duncan Trussell, Burt Kreischer, Bill Burr, Ari Shaffir, and all these other people are other stand-up comedians that are on the podcast pretty frequently, and most of them have a podcast themselves.
You know, like, you see that vicious jealousy in chimpanzees. Like, one of the things that chimpanzees do when they attack people, one of the things they attack people over is unfairness.
And moving on to the last on the list, it wouldn't be a Joe Rogan podcast if he doesn't mention things like apes, monkeys, gorillas, chimpanzees, and things like that. I'm not sure why, but he mentions apes and monkeys and things like that almost every other podcast, and it's definitely one of the most frequent subjects that you will hear on the podcast. He obviously has a fascination with these creatures, and he commonly mentions our similarities between these animals and just mainly how primal and crazy and vicious they can be. And he commonly mentions us coming from that, and like that's part of the reason why humans are the way they are in cruelty or in war and big calculated, just destruction. There was even a point within the Elon Musk podcast where Elon Musk was just like, when was the last time you talked about apes? And he just laughed really, really hard and just said that he was asking the wrong guy because he talks about apes like every other day.
I mean, when's the last time you talked about chimps?
Me?
Yeah.
All the time.
You do?
Talking to the wrong guy.
Unfortunately,
this fucking podcast, dude, I talk about chimps every other episode.
Okay.
People are laughing right now.
So yeah, those are the 5 most common things you will probably hear on the Joe Rogan Podcast. If you think I left any out, definitely let me know down in the comments section. I really thought on this and tried to pick out very, very common things that are talked about on there. But I may have missed some, and if I did, definitely let me know down below. But yeah, that's going to be it for this one. If you like this one, hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I will see you in the next one. Peace.